Hello, my name is Drew Tyndall, and I'm doing a speech over the Reverend St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis was born in 1182 during the phase between the Dark Ages and the Renaissance. His father, Pietro de Bernardone, was a wealthy merchant that sold silk that he has gathered from all over the world. His mother was Donna Pica from the southern province of France of noble heritage. He was born Giovanni, but nicknamed Francisco, meaning the French man, by his Italian childhood friends due to the fact that his mother was French and brought him up in the mannerisms and language of her birthplace. The reason for this speech is to look at the life of St. Francis and see all the turning points in his life that made him one of the most humble men that has ever walked the earth. Some say he walked closer to Christ than anyone else. We will start with his upbringing and end with his accomplishments. Giovanni was a soldier, he was a builder, and a founder of many church reform movements. He stated near the time of his death, "I have found the secret of life in being the servant and secondary figure." We all know the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, and most of us know his relationship to the animals and the stories of his singing to the birds and wild dogs. We even know of his poetic verses that come off with the fragrance of roses. But do we know of the suffering and humility of his walk with Christ? In the 11th century, the times were hard, and even though St. Francis was brought up by semi-wealthy parents, there was something missing in his life. The end of slavery, reform of the church, and the war were always on the horizons, which led St. Francis to joining the Crusades. Slavery was beginning to melt, and the Dark Ages were almost over, which led to the Renaissance era in time. The slaves were turning to serfs, and which meant they could farm and raise families, and the lords of the lands were freeing the slaves due to political and religious pressures. The reform of the church was in full swing in the early years of his life that was headed by Pope Gregory VII. The Catholic Church had come under fire for many reasons. One of the reasons was the clergy across the board were financially corrupt. They were becoming fat cats by stealing from the rich and the poor and putting it in their pockets. The reform told the clergy that they had to live a more self-sacrificing life, including celibacy. That was a new turn on the reform. A quote from Pope Gregory VII was, "The world came into the church by a newer and nearer door." Now, with all this going on, they also had the Crusades going on. They were in full force because of nomadic Islamic militants attacking settlements during the night. The war between Islam's Muhammad and the Christians' Christ was being fought in all corners of the world. St. Francis had a community responsibility to go to war for the name of the Savior. So in other words, he was fighting for Christ. In 1204, Francis went to war, stating to his father, "I shall come back a great prince." Apparently, he had not been humbled at this point. St. Francis was stricken sick during the Crusades and was forced to come home with a humbling experience came over him. As far as the war, he was a brave soul and fought hard. But he was coming through a dark ravine called the Valley of Humiliation when he had an epiphany. During his return home, he came across a leper, and St. Francis was frightened more than he was on the battlefield. You see, lepers in that day were scorned, and St. Francis didn't know what to do. He dismounted his horse and found himself crying and hugging the peasant leper, where he gave him a kiss on the hand and all of his belongings. He noticed that the place where he kissed was planted. It had cleared up. He felt compassion in his heart for the pain and struggle of the leper and pursued helping the lepers across the land. Some say he found Christ from helping lepers. Very similar to how Christ lived. He looked back at what was called the Valley of Humiliation and saw that it was brightening up with flowers and color, and felt humility for the first time. When he returned home, he found the church of Saint Damien of Assisi in ruins. He heard a voice from a divine source saying to him, "Francis, seest thou not that my house is in ruins? Go restore it for me." He took money from his father and started to rebuild the church. His father was out of town at the time, so he didn't have a way of asking him. So he just took the money thinking that it would be all right. Well, his father found out when he got home and took the poor lad to court and imprisoned him until the trial. Now, the Bishop Guido summoned him to court and ordered him to pay back his father and everything, saying, "Thou shalt not steal." Now, St. Francis stated to the bishop, "Lord Bishop, not only the money, but everything I have of him I will restore to him, even the very clothes he has given me." Then he disrobed before the court and was heard as he walked out, "Hear all of you, hear and understand. Until now I have called Pietro Bernardone my father, but now I wish to say, our Father who art in heaven." It's pretty tough. He disowned his father at that point and reclaimed his Father in heaven. Now the new church order was in full swing in defeating the evil by charity and kindness instead of by war. And it had head spinning, and St. Francis of Assisi was just beginning. You see, the order of Friars Minor was established for followers of St. Francis that gave up their worldly possessions to spread the word of God. The good Bishop of Assisi stressed what horror it was to live like the friars with no possessions, living from hand to mouth, and sleeping on hard ground. And Francis said in a humble fashion, the way he always did, "If we had any possessions, we would need weapons and laws to defend them." Pretty eloquently put. He argued that they could go anywhere they needed to go in the name of Christ, and if they had possessions like ordinary men, they would be just that, ordinary men. Later, young Franciscan monks stated, "A monk should own nothing but his heart." The meaning is that a follower of Christ should have in his possession only the songs of the Lord. Francis' first friend of the church pleaded for the first order. He was Cardinal Giovanni de San Paolo. He argued that even though it was a hard life living from hand to mouth, not knowing what or if, even if you are going to get to eat supper that night, it is by their choice to live like that and spread the gospel. Even in the gospel, it spells out that Jesus lived the same way. So to speak, Francis was living in the likeness of Christ again. He was walking in the footsteps of our Savior. Now, the first order of St. Francis had entered the history books, and St. Francis was actually acknowledged for the first time by the church. Now, the order of St. Clare was started because women that wanted to help follow the Lord the way the men did needed a place also. Now, Clare was of nobility and was 17. She enthusiastically yearned for the covenant life. She wanted to work side by side with St. Francis. Their beautiful friendship blossomed, and St. Francis helped her escape from her home so that she could pursue her passion, living a life serving the Lord. Now, you would think being 17 in nowadays times that would be sacrilegious to leave your parents to go follow a covenant. But back then, children were going to war at the age of 14. It was no big deal for somebody 16, 17 years old to get married. So, being 17, she was actually considered an adult. Now, with St. Francis' help, St. Clare was part of one of the biggest feminine movements of all time, creating a safe haven for nuns. She shares her place with one of the most powerful women in history. Now, the third order of St. Francis was a uniting of the sexes, so to speak. On the 16th of April of 1210, St. Francis was blessed by the Pope and was assigned the Church of San Giorgio. The congregation had to stand or kneel because there wasn't enough room for all of them. And Bishop Guido invited him to preach in the great cathedral of San Rufino, where there was standing room only there. Everyone from Assisi came to see the saint. St. Francis's father showed up and was full of pride, even though he still didn't understand what his son was doing. He saw that the Bernardone name had been blessed by the Pope, so he was pleased. His son, in a strange way, was a success, even though he had no worldly possessions. Wow, that's powerful. He proved to the world that the man that left Assisi humiliated came home a humble hero whose self-imposed poverty had been pronounced pleasing to God through the Pope and as the true gospel of God. Now, to sum this up, there was a quote from Dr. Wayne Dyer that says, "The Italian founder of the Franciscan order of monks, St. Francis, approached religion with joyousness and a love of nature, calling all living beings his brothers and sisters." Now that is a true meaning of humility. On his deathbed, he said, "Lay my naked body on the bare ground, for thus, in the arms of my dear Lady Poverty, do I wish to die." He died on the 3rd of October in the year 1226, and his legacy holds strong.